Tonight, we're doing something a little different. No wars, no kings making speeches, no dramatic battles with dramatic music. The stuff the history books skip, the slow, quiet, deeply human parts of medieval life. What people ate for breakfast, how long it took to put on their clothes, what they worried about before they fell asleep, in beds that, honestly, weren't all that different from yours. Historians call this social history. I call it the good stuff. Before we get into it, go ahead and like the video, hit subscribe if you enjoy this kind of thing, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always strange and wonderful to see who's up at this hour. Now, find a comfortable position, maybe dim the screen a little, because tonight you're going somewhere far away from here. We are going to travel back, far back, to a time before electricity, before alarm clocks, before the particular anxiety of checking your phone at 2 a.m, just firelight, cold stone, and a world that moved so slowly it would make your head spin. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive it. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the Middle Ages. It wasn't loud, it wasn't always dramatic. Most of it was actually incredibly boring, repetitive, slow, quiet, fields that needed plowing, bread that needed baking, bells that rang at the same time every single day for your entire life, which makes it perfect for falling asleep too. So settle in, pull whatever you're hugging a little closer. We're going to spend the next few hours together, you and me, wandering very, very slowly through the medieval world. Let's begin. So, let's talk about where you're sleeping tonight. And I want you to lower your expectations significantly. Because in medieval Europe, for most people, a bed was not really a bed. It was more of a pile of straw on the floor. Maybe a wooden frame if you were lucky. A rough wool blanket if you were very lucky. And the person next to you if you needed warmth. Which you did. Because it was cold. It was almost always cold. Now, here's something people don't think about. We treat sleep like a private thing. A personal thing. You close your door, you get your pillow, you have your side of the bed. Medieval people didn't have that. Most peasant families slept in one room, together, all of them. Parents, children, sometimes the grandparents, sometimes a servant, sometimes, and this is real, the animals. Not because they were strange, but because the animals produced body heat, and body heat was survival. So picture this. You're lying on a straw mattress, which is exactly what it sounds like. A rough cloth sack, filled with straw. Maybe some dried grass or hay mixed in. And if the family was a little better off, maybe some wool stuffed in there too. It smelled like the earth. It rustled every time you moved. And every few months, you had to replace the straw. Because it compressed. It rotted. Things started living in it. Things like fleas, lice, the occasional mouse. Welcome to medieval bedtime. Close-up of candlelight on rough wooden walls. Shadows moving slowly. Now. The mattress was just the beginning. What you put on top of it was almost as important. Blankets in the Middle Ages were heavy, rough, usually wool. Not soft wool, the scratchy, dense kind that kept you warm, but also felt like wearing a potato sack. Linen was a luxury. Cotton barely existed in Europe yet. So you wore your clothes to bed. Not pajamas. Your actual clothes. The same ones you wore during the day. Because you needed the warmth, and because changing into something else every night was a concept that hadn't really caught on yet. And pillows, if you had one. It was stuffed with straw or wool or, for the wealthy, down feathers. For most people it was a rolled up piece of cloth, or a folded cloak, or nothing at all. You just put your head on the mattress. Now I want you to settle into that image for a moment. Because this is where we're spending the night. Low ceiling above you. The smell of smoke and straw. The sound of the fire slowly dying. Someone else breathing nearby. Maybe a child shifting in their sleep. Maybe a dog by the door. And outside, complete darkness, no streetlights, no glow from a neighbor's window, no distant sound of traffic, just wind. And maybe an owl. It's quieter than anything you've ever heard. Wide shot of a medieval village at night. total darkness except for a faint orange glow from one window. Here's something interesting. Medieval people didn't sleep the way we do. We sleep in one long block. 7, 8 hours. Straight through. Alarm goes off. Day begins. That's actually a pretty modern idea. For most of human history, and this was studied and documented, people slept in two parts. They'd go to sleep shortly after dark. Sleep for 4 or 5 hours. Then wake up. Naturally. In the middle of the night. And they'd be awake for an hour or two. Sometimes they'd pray. Sometimes they'd talk quietly. Sometimes they'd just lie there in the dark, thinking. Then they'd drift back to sleep, and sleep until morning. Historians call this segmented sleep, or first sleep and second sleep. And it wasn't considered unusual. It wasn't insomnia. It was just how sleep worked. There are references to it in medieval literature, in church documents, in legal records. People wrote about the first sleep the way we'd write about lunch. It was just a normal part of life, which means right now, wherever you are, whatever time it is. If you wake up at 2 a.m. and can't fall back asleep immediately, you're not broken, you're just medieval. Slow pan across a monastery at night, a single candle in a high window. Now, the wealthy slept differently. Of course they did. If you were a lord, a bishop, a merchant with money, your bed was a statement. A wealthy medieval bed was enormous. Heavy wooden frame, curtains hanging around it on all 4 sides. Not for decoration, but for warmth and privacy. To keep the drafts out, to trap body heat inside. These curtains were valuable. Sometimes they were listed separately in wills. I leave my bed curtains to my eldest son. That's how important they were. The mattress was stuffed with wool or down. You had linen sheets, actual pillows, maybe a fur cover on top for winter. And the bed itself was raised off the floor, high enough that you needed a step to climb in, because the floor was cold. The floor was always cold. Stone or packed earth, and the cold came up through it like it had somewhere to be. Sometimes there was even a small bed at the foot of the main bed, for a servant, who slept there all night, ready in case they were needed. Imagine that being your job. Sleep at the foot of someone else's bed. Don't snore, don't move too much. Be ready. Interior of a reconstructed medieval great hall at night. Dying fire. Sleeping shapes on the floor. And then there were the people in between, not poor enough to sleep on straw on a dirt floor. Not rich enough for the carved wooden bed with the curtains. The middle, merchants, craftsmen, minor clergy. They had wooden bed frames. Simple but real. Rope strung across the frame to support the mattress. Hence the old phrase, sleep tight, because if the ropes went slack, the mattress sagged. And sleeping on a sagging mattress was even worse than it sounds. You tighten the ropes before bed. Sleep tight. These things had history behind them. Simple things. Words we still use from a world that looked nothing like ours. So, here we are. End of a long medieval day. The fire is low. The candle is almost gone. The house is full of the sounds of other people sleeping. The straw beneath you crinkles as you shift. The wool blanket is heavy across your chest. Outside, the village is completely dark. Completely quiet. And somewhere, far across the fields, a monastery bell rings. Once. Not for you, just because it always does. Close your eyes. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Chapter 2 is coming, but there's no rush. It's the middle of the night. You're asleep. The village is quiet. The fire is down to embers. The whole world has gone dark and still. And then a bell rings. Not an alarm. Not an emergency. Just a bell. Low, steady, patient. Somewhere across the fields, in a building made of cold stone, a group of men are getting out of bed, in the dark, in the cold, because it's time to pray. Welcome to the medieval monastery at 2 a.m. Now, here's something worth understanding before we go any further. In medieval Europe, the church didn't just influence daily life. It was daily life. the calendar, the weeks, the hours of the day, the reasons you worked and the reasons you rested. All of it ran through the church, and nowhere was that more true than in the monastery. Monks live by something called the divine office, also called the liturgy of the hours, which is exactly what it sounds like. A schedule of prayers spread across the entire day and night, 8 times a day, every day. The monks stopped whatever they were doing and prayed together. 8 times. For context, most of us struggle to check our phones less than 8 times an hour. These men prayed 8 times a day, every single day, for their entire lives. Let me walk you through this schedule, because it's genuinely remarkable. The first prayer of the day was called matins, or sometimes vigils, and it happened, depending on the monastery and the season, somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning. Not at dawn, not at sunrise, in the actual middle of the night. The bell rang, the monks got up. They walked in silence through dark stone corridors to the chapel, and they prayed for up to an hour, sometimes longer, chanting, reading scripture, sitting in wooden stalls in a cold stone room while the rest of the world slept. Then, if they were lucky, they went back to bed for a few hours. Then the bell rang again. This one was called lauds, just before dawn, or at dawn, depending on the season. Then prime, at the first hour of daylight. Then terce, mid-morning. Then sext, at noon. Then none, mid-afternoon, which, interesting side note, is where the word noon actually comes from. The prayer called none was originally at the 9th hour of the day, which was roughly 3 in the afternoon. Over time it shifted earlier, and the name stuck to midday instead. Language is strange like that. Words outlive the things that made them. Then vespers, at sunset, and finally compline, just before bed. 8 prayers, every day, without exception. Rain, snow, harvest, famine, war outside the walls. The bell rang, you got up, you prayed. Now, let's go back to that middle of the night moment, because I want you to really feel what that was like. It's winter, January, let's say. The monastery is somewhere in northern France, or England, or Germany. It doesn't matter exactly. The cold is the same everywhere. The bell for matins rings at 2 in the morning. You've been asleep for maybe 4 hours. You're a monk. You've been a monk for years. This is not a surprise, but it is still cold. You swing your legs over the side of your narrow bed. Your feet touch the stone floor, and that floor is cold in a way that modern floors simply are not. No underfloor heating, no carpet, no socks thick enough to really help. Just stone. In January, in the dark. You pull your habit on over your sleeping clothes. You don't speak. The rule of silence applies. It almost always applies. You shuffle out of the dormitory and into the corridor. Other monks are doing the same. Dark shapes moving quietly. The sound of sandals on stone. Someone ahead of you carries a small candle. It's the only light. The chapel is at the end of the corridor. It's not warmer in there. If anything, it's colder. High ceilings, stone walls, no fire. Windows that let in the January air like they're trying to. You take your place in the wooden stalls. The cantor, the monk in charge of leading the chant, begins. And the sound starts. Low, slow, ancient. A single voice at first, then more joining in. The sound fills the stone room and bounces off the walls and comes back to you slightly changed, slightly fuller. And for the next hour, in the cold, in the dark, in complete silence except for the chanting, this is what the world sounds like. Here's something interesting about that chant. Gregorian chant, the kind medieval monks sang, wasn't just religious. It was physiological. The slow, sustained notes, the steady breathing it requires, the way it fills a room without sharp edges or sudden changes. Studies have actually shown that listening to Gregorian chant slows the heart rate, lowers blood pressure, deepens breathing. The monks didn't know that in scientific terms, but they knew something. They knew that this sound, in this room, at this hour, did something to a person. Settled them, quieted them, even in the cold, even in the dark. So if you feel yourself getting a little heavier right now, a little slower, that's about 800 years of people feeling exactly the same thing. After matins, the monks returned to their beds. If the schedule allowed it, and it didn't always, they slept until lauds, a few more hours. Then the day began properly. And what a day it was. Because the monastery wasn't just a place for prayer. It was, in many ways, the most productive institution in medieval Europe. Farms, breweries, hospitals, schools, libraries. Monks made beer, bred cattle, copied manuscripts, treated the sick, taught the children of noblemen. All of it organized, all of it scheduled, all of it running on the same bell that woke them at 2 a.m. The bell was everything. There's a phrase historians use sometimes, the tyranny of the bell. Because once the monastery bell set the rhythm of a community, everything bent around it. Farmers in the nearby village knew what the bells meant. The bell for sext meant it was noon, time to eat. The bell for vespers meant the day was ending, time to come in from the fields. The monastery clock was the town clock. And before mechanical clocks, which didn't become common until the 14th century, the monastery bell was the most reliable timekeeping instrument most people had ever encountered. Think about that. Your entire sense of time, where you were in the day, when to eat, when to stop working, when to sleep, determined by a bell rung by a monk who woke up at 2 a.m. Every day, for his entire life. He never complained about it, or if he did, he didn't write it down. Now, not every monk found this easy. The records that survive, the letters, the diaries, the accounts, they tell a more human story than you might expect. There are monks who wrote about falling asleep during matins, nodding off in the choir stalls, head drooping, jolted awake by a neighbor's elbow. There are accounts of monks who struggled with the cold, who wrapped themselves in extra cloth, who positioned themselves near whoever was carrying the most body heat. There are even records of monks who were chronically late to the night office, who heard the bell, and stayed in bed a little longer, and then shuffled in after everyone else had started. 800 years ago, and people were still hitting snooze. Human nature doesn't change very much. There's one more thing I want to tell you about the monastic night, and it's something I find quietly remarkable. After Compline, the last prayer of the day, just before bed, the monastery entered what was called the Great Silence. No talking, no noise. From Compline until after the morning prayers the next day, the monastery was silent. Not just quiet, silent. If you needed to communicate, you used hand signals. A whole system of gestures had been developed over centuries. Specific signs for specific words. For bread, for water, for I need help, for the abbot is coming. But mostly, you just didn't communicate. You moved through the dark corridors. You did what needed doing, you slept, you prayed, you woke, you prayed again, in silence. And here's what strikes me about that. We live in a world of constant noise, constant input, notifications and voices and music and traffic and the hum of devices we don't even notice anymore. And these men, voluntarily, chose silence. Night after night, year after year. Not because they were punished, not because they had no choice, because they believed that in silence something became possible, that noise made impossible. Maybe they were right. So here we are, deep in the medieval night. The monastery bell has rung. The monks have prayed and gone back to their beds. The village is dark. The fire in your hut is almost out. And the world is as quiet as it ever gets. In a few hours, the dawn will come. The peasants will wake before the sun. The bread will need baking. The animals will need feeding. The fields will be cold and waiting. But not yet. Not yet. For now, there is just the dark, and the silence, and the distant fading echo of something ancient being sung in a cold stone room. Let it carry you. The darkness is starting to lift, just barely. That gray, uncertain light that isn't really morning yet, but isn't night anymore either. The kind of light that makes everything look like it's made of the same color. And somewhere in a small hut at the edge of a medieval village, someone is already awake. Not because they wanted to be. Not because they're a morning person, but because the animals need feeding. The fire needs rebuilding. And there is absolutely no coffee. There has never been any coffee. Coffee won't reach most of Europe for another 300 years. Which honestly explains a lot about the Middle Ages. Let's talk about who we're following today. A peasant farmer. A man. Let's call him William, because half of medieval England was named William, who works a small strip of land outside a village in somewhere like Yorkshire or Normandy. He has a wife, a few children, a cow, some chickens. He owns almost nothing. He owes almost everything to the Lord whose land he works. And he has been awake since before sunrise every day of his adult life. William is not remarkable. That's the point. He is the most common person in medieval Europe. A peasant farmer represented somewhere between 70 and 90% of the entire population. Most of history is his story, and most of history forgot to write it down. So let's spend some time with him. William wakes up, and the first thing he does, before he speaks, before he moves, before he even fully opens his eyes, is listen. Because the weather matters more than almost anything else in his life. Is it raining? Is there wind? Does the air smell like frost? The answer to those questions determines the entire day. Whether the field can be plowed, whether the hay can be cut, whether the animals can go out or stay in. He lies there for a moment, still, listening to the roof. A thatched roof in medieval England was not quiet. Rain made it hiss, wind made it shudder. And sometimes, if a bird had nested up there, which they often did, there were other sounds entirely. This morning, though, it sounds dry, cold, probably, but dry. Good enough. He gets up, and immediately, the cold hits him, because the fire went out sometime in the night, or close to out. There might be embers still. There better be embers still, because starting a fire from scratch takes time and effort that William does not have this morning. He crouches by the hearth, which is not a fireplace with a chimney the way you're imagining. It's a fire pit, in the middle of the floor, just a shallow depression in the earth where the fire lives. The smoke drifts up and, ideally, finds its way out through a hole in the roof. Ideally, medieval huts were smoky. Permanently, constantly, inescapably smoky. Your eyes adjusted, your lungs adjusted. You stopped noticing after a while, but you also had a persistent cough for most of your life, and you probably didn't connect the two, because nobody had yet. William blows gently on the embers. A little orange light glows back at him. He feeds it some dry grass, some small sticks, waits. The flame catches. He adds a bigger piece of wood. The hut begins to warm, slowly, barely, but it's something. Now, breakfast. Here's where I have to be honest with you. Medieval peasant breakfast was not good. It was not varied. It was not something you looked forward to. It was something you consumed so that you could continue to exist and do the work that needed doing. The main food, for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, for most meals, for most people, for most of the Middle Ages, was pottage, which is a word that means, essentially, porridge, or stew, or somewhere between the two. You took a pot, you filled it with water, you added whatever you had. Oats, usually, or barley, dried peas, maybe some root vegetables if it was autumn, maybe some herbs from the garden. You hung it over the fire. You waited. And that was breakfast. A bowl of gray, thick, slightly smoky grain porridge. No salt if salt was expensive that week. No seasoning worth mentioning. Just warmth, calories, something in the stomach before a day of physical labor, day after day, week after week, month after month. The same pot, different water, largely the same ingredients. Pottage. There was also ale, and before you get excited, it wasn't the good kind. Medieval small ale was weak, thin, barely fermented. It had about as much alcohol as a very flat, slightly sour glass of something you would immediately put down. But it was safer than the water, and that is a sentence worth sitting with for a moment. The ale was safer than the water, because the water, from the river, from the well, from wherever it came, was often contaminated. People didn't understand germ theory yet. They didn't know why the water sometimes made you sick. They just knew that it did. And that ale, for some reason, usually didn't. So you drank ale. In the morning, with your pottage, starting at sunrise, every day of your life. Which is one medieval habit I suspect some of you might actually consider adopting. William eats his pottage, drinks his ale, doesn't say much. His wife is already moving, feeding the children, checking on the cow. The children eat quickly and quietly because there is nothing else to do, and because children in the Middle Ages were expected to behave like small adults from a very young age. There wasn't much of what we'd called childhood, not because parents didn't love their children. They did, deeply. There are letters and records that make this very clear, but because survival required contribution. A 5-year-old could scare birds off the crops. A 7-year-old could carry water. A 10-year-old could do nearly everything an adult could do. So they did. Now, after breakfast, William goes outside. And this is the moment I want you to picture. He steps out of the hut and into the morning air. Cold, still. Gray light spreading slowly across the fields. The village is waking up around him. Smoke from other huts. The sound of an axe somewhere. A dog barking once and then stopping. The fields stretch out ahead of him. Long, narrow strips. Because that's how medieval fields worked. The village didn't divide land into neat square plots the way we might imagine. It was divided into strips, long, thin ribbons of land running across the open field. Each family had several strips, scattered across different parts of the field. Not together, scattered, so that good land and bad land were shared more or less equally across the village. William's strips are over there, past the common pasture, past where the road bends. He can see them from here. They don't look like much, but they're everything. The work ahead of him today depends on the season, and the season in medieval Europe was not a background detail. It was the entire structure of life. In spring, plowing, breaking the frozen earth open, getting the seed in before the window closed. In summer, tending, weeding, watching the weather, hoping. In autumn, harvest, the most important weeks of the year. Everything depended on those weeks. Too much rain, the grain rotted. Too dry, the yield was poor. A good harvest meant survival. A bad one meant a very hard winter. In winter, recovery, repair. The slowest season, shorter days, less work, more darkness. Right now it's early spring, which means plowing, which is exactly as hard as it sounds. A wooden plow, maybe iron-tipped if the village was lucky. An ox or two pulling it. And William walking behind it all day, guiding it through heavy, resistant earth. Up and down the strip. Up and down for hours. His boots are already muddy. They were muddy yesterday. They will be muddy tomorrow. Mud is the texture of medieval life. It is everywhere, always. In the streets, in the fields, in the hut when you track it in. You stop noticing it the same way you stop noticing the smoke. It's just what the world feels like underfoot. And yet, here's what I want you to hold on to, because it's easy to hear all of this and think, What a miserable life. What a hard, gray, smoky, muddy, cold, exhausting existence. And it was hard. I won't pretend otherwise. But there's something else in the records, too. Something quieter. Songs sung while working in the fields. Community gatherings on feast days. Celebrations that went on for days. Children laughing, neighbors helping neighbors. A life that was deeply, completely embedded in a community. You were never alone, for better and sometimes for worse. You were never alone. Your neighbors knew you, watched out for you, depended on you. The village was a web, every person a thread. William doesn't think about any of this. He just plows his strip, up and down, the cold air in his lungs, the steady pull of the ox ahead of him, the village at his back, the sky turning slowly from gray to pale blue above him. Just a man, in a field, at the beginning of a day, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. There's nowhere to rush to, nothing that can't wait another moment. Just settle a little deeper. Let the field go quiet. Let William disappear into the distance. Chapter 4 is waiting, but only when you're ready. Let's leave the fields for a while. Leave William and his ox and his muddy boots, and walk into town. Because once or twice a week, sometimes once a fortnight, the nearest market town came alive. And when I say came alive, I mean it in the most chaotic, loud, overwhelming, sensory way possible. The medieval market was not a farmer's market. It was not a quiet row of tasteful wooden signs and artisanal preserves. It was noise. It was smell. It was hundreds of people crammed into a dirt street trying to sell things, buy things, argue about things, steal things, and occasionally just stand there blocking everyone else. Basically a shopping mall, but with more livestock. Now, getting to the market was its own adventure, because roads in medieval Europe were not what you'd call reliable. The Romans had built excellent roads across much of Europe. Straight, solid, well-maintained. And then the Roman Empire collapsed, and nobody maintained them. By the early Middle Ages, most of those roads had been reclaimed by mud, grass, and time. What replaced them were tracks, dirt paths worn into the earth by centuries of feet and hooves and cartwheels. In summer, dusty and hard and manageable. In winter, impassable rivers of mud that could swallow a cartwheel up to the axle. In spring, somewhere between the two, and significantly worse than either. William, or his wife, or a neighbor, or all of them together, would have walked several miles to reach the nearest market town, carrying things to sell, a basket of eggs, a bundle of wool, some surplus vegetables if the garden had been generous. Walking, in those boots, on that road, for hours. But then you arrived. And for all its chaos, the market was something. The first thing you noticed was the smell. And I want to be precise here because the medieval market smell was a very specific combination of things that no modern person has ever encountered in quite this concentration. Animals, live ones, chickens in cages, pigs on ropes, cattle penned in the side streets, horses tied everywhere. The smell of animals and everything that comes with animals was constant and absolute. Then bread. Someone was always baking near the market. The smell of bread coming from an open window was one of the better things about medieval town life. Then fish. If the town was near a river or the coast, fish. Fresh, smoked, dried, salted. Fish in various states of freshness and various distances from the concept of fresh. The further you got from the water source, the more creative the definition of fresh became. Then smoke, from cooking fires and forge fires and the general ambient smoke that medieval towns simply lived inside of. And under all of it, mud, wet earth, the smell of a street that had seen 1,000 boots and 100 cartwheels and more animals than you could count. That was the market, before you even saw it. Now you're inside it. The street is narrow, stalls on both sides. Some of them proper wooden structures with awnings. Some of them just a blanket on the ground with things arranged on top. And the noise. Merchants calling out, not quietly, not politely. Shouting. Competing with the merchant next to them and the one across the street and the one further down. Best wool in the county. Fresh bread, still warm. Knives sharpened, pots mended. Animals adding their voices to everything. A pig objecting loudly to its current situation. A horse shifting and stamping somewhere nearby. Chickens always somewhere, just being chickens. And the people. So many people. In a world where most of your daily life was your immediate village, maybe 30, 40 families, a market day could put hundreds of people in front of you. Strangers, faces you didn't recognize. People from other villages further along the road. Occasionally, a merchant from somewhere genuinely far away. A cloth trader from Flanders. A spice merchant from further than you could picture on a map. The market was, in many ways, the medieval internet. The place where information moved. Where news arrived. Where the world briefly became larger than your strip of field and your smoky hut. Let's walk through it slowly. The food stalls first. Bread was sold by the loaf, and this was regulated. Medieval towns had what were called assize laws, rules about the price and weight of bread. If a baker sold underweight bread, the punishment was specific and public. He was strapped to a sled. The underweight loaf was tied around his neck, and he was dragged through the market streets while people watched, which sounds extreme. But bread was not a luxury item. Bread was survival. For most people, bread was the majority of their daily calories. Cheating on the bread was not a minor commercial infraction. It was a threat to people's lives. The baker knew this. Most bakers, as a result, were very careful about their weights. Most, further along, the cloth merchants. This was serious business. Cloth, wool, linen, the occasional silk if the merchant was ambitious, was one of the most traded commodities in medieval Europe. The wool trade, particularly in England, was an entire economy unto itself. English wool was considered some of the best in the world. It was exported to Flanders, modern-day Belgium, where it was woven into cloth. Then the cloth was sold back. An entire continent's textile industry running on English sheep. At the market stall, a woman is examining a bolt of wool. She runs it between her fingers, checks the weight, holds it up to the light. She's been buying cloth her whole life. She knows what good wool feels like and what a merchant is trying to pass off as good wool. The negotiation begins. Medieval prices were not fixed. Everything was negotiable. Every transaction was a small battle of wills between someone who wanted more and someone who wanted to pay less. This has not changed in 800 years. Now, let's talk about the other side of the market. The side that wasn't food and cloth. The blacksmith had a stall. Or more accurately, the blacksmith's apprentice had a stall, selling the products that had been made that week. Nails, hinges, tools, horseshoes, small iron items that were genuinely valuable. A good iron nail was not nothing. Iron cost money, skill cost money. People bought nails individually sometimes. The apothecary was there, selling herbs, dried plants, roots and bark and seeds, things that were medicine or passed for medicine. Lavender for headaches, willow bark for pain, which actually worked because willow bark contains a compound related to aspirin. Various other things for various other complaints that worked considerably less well. There was also the tooth puller, who had a small crowd around him. Because tooth pain was constant and universal in the Middle Ages, and the only solution was removal. No anesthetic, just speed and a firm grip, and trying not to think too hard about it. The crowd around the tooth puller wasn't there for the same reason as the crowd around the bread stall. The crowd around the tooth puller was there because watching someone else's tooth get pulled out was, apparently, entertaining. Medieval entertainment had a very different threshold than ours. And then there was the news. Because the market was where you heard things. There was no newspaper. No printing press yet. That wouldn't arrive until the 1440s. Information spread by word of mouth, and the market was where mouths gathered. You heard about the harvest in the next county, about the lord who had raised his taxes, about the strange weather last month that nobody could explain, about the road to the south being impassable because of flooding, about the king, always something about the king, wars, marriages, deaths, taxes. The king was a constant presence in conversation for people who would never in their lives see the king. And rumors, always rumors. The medieval mind was extraordinarily fertile ground for rumors. Strange light seen over the hill. A cow that had given blood instead of milk. A traveler who claimed to have passed through a village where everyone had died in a single night. Some of these were true. The medieval world had genuine horrors in it. Plagues, famines, wars that arrived without warning. So the rumors were taken seriously. Because sometimes the rumors turned out to be real, and you wanted to know before it got to you. By midday, the market is at its fullest. The noise has reached a peak. Everyone who was coming has come. The streets are as crowded as they're going to get. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a person sits down, on a step, or a low wall, or a patch of ground slightly out of the way, and eats their lunch, which is, almost certainly, bread and something. Bread and cheese if they're lucky. Bread and a piece of dried meat. Bread and nothing if it's been a hard week. Just sitting there. In the noise and the smell and the press of people. Watching. The medieval peasant at rest in the market is one of my favorite images in all of history. Not a king, not a knight, not anyone a chronicle would ever bother to mention. Just a person, tired from the walk, eating their bread, watching the world move around them. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly human, perfectly here. The afternoon brings a slowdown. The serious buying and selling is done. The serious merchants are packing up or counting their coins in back rooms. What's left is the tail end of the day. The reduced prices on things that won't keep. Fish that needs to go today. Bread that was baked this morning and won't be good tomorrow. And the entertainment. Because the market didn't just sell goods, it sold distraction. There were traveling performers, jugglers, acrobats, a man with a trained dog. Occasionally, a bear on a chain, which draws a crowd immediately, and will continue to draw a crowd for as long as the bear is willing to cooperate. There was music, a musician with a stringed instrument sitting near enough to the crowd to catch coins, playing something repetitive and pleasant, the same melody, over and over, because the crowd changes, but the musician stays. And there was the storyteller, standing on something slightly elevated, speaking loudly enough to hold the edges of a drifting audience, telling stories about knights and saints and monsters and far-off places, stories that everyone had heard before and wanted to hear again. Because that's what stories do. They don't have to be new. They just have to be told well, in the right voice, at the right pace. Slowly enough that you can follow every word. Slowly enough that the world around you fades a little. And it's just the voice, and the story, and the afternoon light going gold above the market rooftops. By late afternoon, the market is thinning. People are heading home, the same roads they came in on. But slower now, heavier, carrying what they bought, tired from the walk and the noise and the standing and the negotiating. William, or his wife, starts the walk back to the village. The road is quiet now, the noise of the market fading behind them. Fields on either side, the sky going pale at the edges. They don't talk much. There's nothing that needs saying right now. Just the road, and the weight of the basket, and the slow, steady rhythm of feet on a dirt path. Step, step, step. The market is behind you now. The noise, the smell, the press of all those people. All of it fading. Just the road, just the fields, just the sound of your own footsteps in the quiet. Let that quiet settle. There's no hurry. Chapter 5 is coming. The castle is waiting. Cold stone and firelight in a world completely different from the one we just left. But not yet. For now, just walk. Leave the road. Leave the mud and the market and the open fields. And walk through a different kind of door entirely. Stone above you. Stone below you. Stone on every side. Welcome to the castle. And before you get too comfortable with that image, before you picture the tapestries and the feasting and the knights in gleaming armor, I want to tell you something. Castles were cold. Profoundly, completely, inescapably cold. Stone holds cold the way a sponge holds water. In winter, the walls themselves became a source of chill. You could have a fire in the room and still feel the cold radiating off the wall 3 feet away. The wealthy medieval lord didn't live in comfort. He lived in a slightly more decorated version of the same misery as everyone else, just with better curtains. Let's talk about what a castle actually was, because the word conjures something very specific. Towers, drawbridges, a moat, flags. And yes, those things existed, but the castle was first and foremost a military structure, a fortification. It existed to be defended. Everything else, the living quarters, the great hall, the kitchens, came second to that fundamental purpose, which meant the windows were small, deliberately small. Large windows let in light and warmth and fresh air. They also let in arrows, so the windows stayed small. Narrow slits in thick stone walls. Enough to see through, enough to shoot through, not enough to make the room anything approaching pleasant. The result was that most rooms inside a medieval castle were dark, even in the middle of the day, even in summer. You needed candles or torches inside a castle at noon. Candles and torches that produced smoke, which had nowhere to go, because the windows were too small. Medieval interior design was really working against itself at every turn. Now, let's meet the people who lived here. At the top, the Lord. He owned the castle, or held it in service to someone above him. Because medieval society was a ladder, and almost nobody was at the very top. Even powerful lords owed allegiance to someone. A duke to a king, a baron to a duke, a knight to a baron. All the way up to the king, who owed allegiance, in theory at least, to God. The lord of a moderate castle might have a household of 30 to 50 people. Servants, soldiers, clerks, a chaplain, a steward who managed the household accounts. And all of them lived inside these walls. All of them were part of this world. It was not a private life. The medieval lord had almost no privacy at all. He ate in front of his household. He conducted business in front of his household. He slept in a room that his servants entered freely. Getting dressed in the morning was a semi-public event. There were servants whose specific job was to help the lord dress, to hand him each piece of clothing in the correct order, to fasten the things that needed fastening. This was considered an honor, to dress the lord. People competed for this position, which tells you something about how differently medieval people understood the concept of personal space. The heart of the castle was the Great Hall, and this room deserves its name. High ceilings, long wooden tables running the length of the room, a raised platform at one end, the dais, where the lord and his family sat, a massive fireplace, or sometimes a central fire pit, like in the peasant hut, but scaled up enormously. Rushes on the floor, which were dried reeds or grasses, strewn across the stone to provide some insulation and softness. They smelled of herbs if the household was careful, they smelled of everything else if it wasn't. The great hall was where the household ate together, twice a day usually, a main meal around midday and a lighter supper in the evening. And the seating arrangement at those meals was not casual. Where you sat told everyone in that room exactly who you were. The Lord at the high table, elevated above everyone else, his family and honored guests near him. Further down the table, knights, senior servants, the household steward. And at the far end, the lowest end, furthest from the Lord and furthest from the fire, the junior servants, the people who mattered least in the hierarchy. Eating the same meal in the same room, but in a completely different world. The food changed depending on where you sat, too. The Lord got the best cuts, the freshest bread, the better wine. By the time the food reached the far end of the table, it had made a journey. Let's slow down now, and spend some time in the castle at the quieter hours, not the feast, not the drama, just the ordinary day. Morning in the castle starts early. The servants are up before the Lord. Fires need rebuilding. Water needs heating. The kitchen needs to start on the day's meals. The castle kitchen was a serious operation. Large, hot, constantly busy. A full household needed feeding twice a day, every day. That meant bread baked daily, meat roasted or stewed, sauces prepared, pies assembled. The head cook, the master cook, was a powerful figure in the household. He controlled the food, and food was power in a way we don't fully appreciate anymore. The kitchen staff were up before dawn, stoking fires, preparing dough, starting the long, slow process of making the food that the household would eat that afternoon, while the Lord slept, while the great hall sat empty and cold, while the castle was quiet except for the sound of work happening in the rooms no one saw. By mid-morning, the castle is awake. The Lord has been dressed. He has attended morning prayers in the chapel. Every castle of any size had a chapel, and attendance was expected. And now the business of the day begins, because the castle was not just a residence. It was an administrative center. The Lord held court. People came to him with disputes, with requests, with rent payments and complaints and appeals. A farmer whose neighbor had stolen his pig. A widow asking for an extension on what she owed. Two brothers arguing over who inherited their father's strip of land. The Lord, or his steward acting on his behalf, heard all of it. Made decisions, issued judgments. Medieval justice was local in a way that's hard to imagine now. The Lord of the castle was, for most people in his territory, the highest authority they would ever encounter. What he decided was what happened. He could be fair, he could be corrupt, he could be wise or foolish or somewhere in between, and the people who came before him had very little recourse if they didn't like his answer. You hoped, essentially, that your Lord was a reasonable man. Many were, some were not, and you lived with whichever one you got. Now, let's talk about the soldiers, because a castle without soldiers was just an expensive stone house. The garrison, the permanent soldiers stationed at the castle, had their own rhythm. Training in the morning, usually in the courtyard. Sword practice, archery, wrestling. Not because a battle was coming necessarily, but because readiness was the point. You trained so that if something happened, you were ready. The life of a castle soldier was mostly waiting. Long stretches of complete uneventfulness, punctuated by the occasional crisis. Guard duty on the walls. Escorting the Lord when he traveled. Chasing off the occasional group of bandits from the road. In the evening, the soldiers ate in the great hall with everyone else, and then gathered in their own quarters. Playing dice, talking, sharpening weapons that didn't need sharpening because there was nothing else to do. The medieval soldier spent the vast majority of his career being thoroughly, deeply bored, which is perhaps the most relatable thing about him. And then, one by one, the candles go out, the servants clear the tables, the musician packs up and finds a corner to sleep in. The soldiers head back to their quarters. The lord climbs the stairs to his chamber, where the curtained bed is waiting, where a servant has already been in to warm the room as much as is possible, which is not very much, but it's something. The castle at night is a different place entirely. Dark in a way that cities never are now. Quiet in a way that's almost absolute. Just the wind against the walls, the occasional sound of a guard on the battlements, the settling of old stone in the cold, and somewhere in the depths of the building, a fire still burning. Someone always tending it, because the fire could not go out. The fire was the warmth and the light and the cooking and the life of the whole place. Someone always watching it, through the night, every night, keeping the dark at bay, just barely. The castle is asleep now, stone and shadow in the slow breath of 50 people in their beds. The fire burning low in the great hall, the wind outside finding every crack in the mortar. Let the stone walls hold you for a moment. Let the cold and the quiet settle. There's nowhere to be, nothing to do, just this, just the dark, just the warmth of a fire somewhere nearby that you don't have to tend. Chapter 6 is waiting. The monastery at dusk. Bells and candlelight and silence deeper than anything the castle could manage. But not yet. Rest here a little longer. The sun is going down. Not dramatically, not in a blaze of color, just quietly retreating. The way it does in autumn, the light going from gold to pale to gray, and the world getting smaller and quieter as it goes. Somewhere in the countryside, set back from the road, surrounded by fields it owns and orchards it tends and a wall that keeps the outside world at a respectful distance, a monastery is settling into evening. The bell for vespers will ring soon. The monks know this without looking at anything. They always know. After years in this place, the bells live inside you. You feel them coming before they arrive. This is a world that moves differently from the one outside the wall. Slower, more deliberate. Every hour accounted for. Every action assigned its proper time and place. Come inside. We visited the monastery briefly in Chapter 2. In the middle of the night. The cold corridors, the monks rising for matins in the dark. But now it's evening. And the monastery in the evening is a different thing entirely. The day's work is winding down. The fields are emptying. The workshops are quieting. The kitchen has served the one main meal of the day, eaten in silence while someone read aloud from a religious text, and is now being cleaned and prepared for tomorrow. The monks are moving through the last hours of daylight with that particular quality of movement that comes from decades of the same routine. Unhurried, purposeful, not slow because they're tired. Slow because they have learned, through years of this life, that rushing is a kind of distraction. And distraction is the enemy of the contemplative life. Everything here is done at the pace it needs to be done at, no faster. Let me tell you about the cloister, because the cloister is the heart of the monastery, not the chapel. Though the chapel is the soul, the cloister is the heart. It's a square courtyard, open to the sky in the middle. Usually a garden there. Simple, herbs maybe, a tree, a well, and running around all four sides, a covered walkway, stone columns, a roof overhead. Open on one side to the garden. This is where the monks walked, in the hours between prayers and work. Not walking to get somewhere, just walking. Round and round the cloister, in silence. Thinking, praying, meditating on whatever scripture had been read that day. The cloister walk is one of the great inventions of medieval life, a space designed for nothing except moving slowly and thinking quietly. No destination, no purpose except the walking itself. Round and round. The garden in the middle changing with the seasons. The light changing through the day. The monk unchanged, steady, present, just walking. Now. The bell for Vespers rings, and something happens in the monastery that I find quietly beautiful. Everything stops. Whatever was being done stops. A monk copying a manuscript puts down his pen. Mid-sentence sometimes. Not because the sentence isn't important, but because the bell is more important. The prayer is more important. Everything bends toward the prayer. They file into the chapel. In order, always in order. The older monks first, the newer ones behind. In silence. The shuffle of sandals on stone. The rustle of habits. And then the wooden stalls creak as they take their places. And the chanting begins. Vespers is one of the more beautiful of the daily offices. Evening prayer, sung at the close of the day. The light in the chapel at this hour is extraordinary. What little comes through the narrow windows is the last warm light of the day. The candles on the altar catching it, the stone walls going amber and gold, and the sound of 30 or 40 voices singing together in that particular way. Slow, sustained, ancient, filling the space completely. There is nowhere else in the medieval world that sounds like this. After Vespers, a brief period of reading. Personal reading, or communal reading in the chapter house. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational document of Benedictine monastic life, specified that monks should spend time each day in what it called lectio divina, sacred reading, not reading to acquire information, not reading to finish something, reading slowly, meditatively, reading a passage and sitting with it, turning it over, letting it settle. The medieval monk read the way we never read anymore. 1 page, maybe less, for an hour. We read to consume, they read to absorb. They probably got more out of 1 page than most of us get out of an entire book. And then there was the work of the scriptorium. This deserves its own moment. Because the scriptorium, the writing room, was where something genuinely remarkable happened. Every day, for centuries. Before the printing press, every book was made by hand, every single one. A monk, or several monks, sat at a desk, with a quill pen, an inkwell, a ruled piece of parchment, and copied, word by word, line by line, page by page. An entire book, copied by hand, might take months. A large Bible, years. The scriptorium was usually positioned to catch the best natural light. South-facing windows, high ceilings. Because the work required light. The letters were small. The parchment was expensive. Mistakes were costly. You could scrape a mistake off parchment with a knife and write over it. But it left a mark. It always left a mark. So, you were careful. Extraordinarily careful. The pen moving slowly across the page. Letter by letter. Hour after hour. In silence. Here's something that always strikes me about the scriptorium. The monks who worked there were not just copying. They were preserving. Think about what was happening in medieval Europe. Roman civilization had collapsed. Libraries had been lost, burned, abandoned. Texts that had taken centuries to produce. Philosophy, science, history, literature were disappearing. And the monasteries were catching them, copying them, storing them, passing them forward through time. When a monk sat down to copy a text, even a text he didn't fully understand, even a text in a language he only partially knew, he was doing something that mattered enormously. He was making sure it survived. He was handing something across the centuries to people he would never meet. To us, in a sense. Some of what we know about ancient Rome and Greece, some of what we know about the ancient world at all, exists because a monk sat in a cold scriptorium in the 8th century and copied it out by hand. Word by word, in silence. By candlelight, not knowing that anyone would ever read it, just knowing that it should not be lost. That's not nothing. That's everything. Let's spend a moment in the monastery garden, before the last light goes. Every monastery had one, sometimes small, sometimes extensive, and always productive. The monastic garden was not decorative. It was pharmaceutical. It was culinary. It was the monastery's medicine cabinet and spice rack and larder all in one. Herbs for healing. Lavender and rosemary and feverfew and dozens of others whose names most of us have forgotten. Vegetables for the kitchen. Leeks and onions and cabbages and root vegetables that would keep through winter. Sometimes a physic garden specifically for medicinal plants. Carefully tended, carefully labeled, in a monastery where literacy meant that labels were actually useful. The monk who tended the garden was called the hortilanus, the gardener, and his knowledge was specific and deep. Which plants helped which ailments, which combinations worked, which should never be combined. Centuries of accumulated knowledge passed from one gardener to the next. Written down in herbals, manuscripts full of plant descriptions and medical notes and careful illustrations. The monastery garden at dusk, the last light catching the tops of the herb beds, the smell of rosemary and damp earth, a monk moving slowly between the rows, checking, tending, pulling a weed here, touching a leaf there, just a man in a garden at the end of a day, in complete quiet. And then, Compline, the last prayer of the day. The bell rings, the monks gather one final time in the chapel. It's dark now outside. The candles on the altar are the only light, and the prayer that is sung at Compline is specifically about the night, about entrusting yourself to the darkness, about letting go of the day. There is a hymn sung at Compline that has been sung every night in monasteries for over 1,000 years. Te lucis ante terminum, before the ending of the light, a prayer asking for protection through the night, from nightmares, from darkness, from the fears that come when the sun goes down. The same words every night, for 1,000 years, in hundreds of monasteries across Europe, millions of mouths, billions of times. Something about that continuity is almost impossible to hold in your mind. The sheer, unbroken length of it, night after night, generation after generation. The same prayer, the same darkness outside, the same candle, the same need for something to carry you through until morning. After Compline, the great silence falls. We talked about this before. No speaking, no noise, no unnecessary movement. The monastery closes in on itself like a hand folding. The monks go to their dormitory, long and narrow, a row of simple beds along each wall. No curtains, no privacy. Just a bed and a small shelf and the darkness and the breathing of the men around you. They sleep in their habits sometimes, ready to rise for matins, which will come in a few hours, which always comes. But for now, silence. The deepest silence of the day. The great silence, pressing in from every side like something warm. Outside the monastery walls, the world continues. Somewhere, William is asleep in his hut. Somewhere, the castle guard is on the wall in the cold. Somewhere, a market town is dark and locked and quiet. And in here, 30 monks breathing slowly in the dark. The same as last night, the same as tomorrow night, the same as it has been for 100 years and will be for 100 more. Just breath, and stone, and silence. Let the silence of the monastery settle over you, that deep, deliberate, chosen quiet. The kind of quiet that takes practice, the kind of quiet that holds you. Breathe. There's no bell coming for you tonight. No matins, no cold floor. Just this. Just the dark. Just the weight of a long day slowly leaving your body. Chapter 7 is there whenever you need it. The village healer. Herbs and firelight and old knowledge passed down in whispers. But only when you're ready. You might not need it at all.
There's a cottage at the edge of the village, slightly apart from the others. Not far. Just a little separate. The way certain things are always kept a little separate. The garden around it is dense. More plants than you'd expect. Different plants than the neighbors grow. Not cabbages and leeks. Something else. Things with small flowers and strange leaves and names that most people in the village couldn't tell you. Inside, bundles of dried herbs hanging from every beam, pots on shelves, small clay jars with stoppers, pouches of dried things tied with cord. A fire always burning, something always simmering. And in the middle of all of it, a woman, older, calm in the way that only comes from having seen a great deal and decided most of it was manageable. This is the village healer, and in medieval Europe, she was often the most important person for miles. Let's be clear about something first. In medieval Europe, if you were sick, you had options. Not good options, necessarily, but options. If you were wealthy and lived near a town, you might consult a physician, a university-trained doctor who had studied medicine in Latin from texts written by ancient Greek and Arab scholars. He would examine you, take your pulse, study a sample of your urine. Medieval physicians were extremely interested in urine. And then diagnose you based on a theory of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. The idea being that health was a balance of these 4 substances, and illness was an imbalance. The treatment, therefore, was to restore the balance, which often meant removing something from the body. Bloodletting was the most common medical procedure in medieval Europe. You were sick, so they made you bleed. From the arm, usually, sometimes from behind the ear. A specific vein for each ailment, according to the medical texts. It almost never helped. It frequently made things worse. But it was official. It was learned. It came with Latin terminology, so it continued for centuries. But most people weren't wealthy, and most people didn't live near a town, which meant the physician was not an option. What they had was her. The woman at the edge of the village with the herbs and the fire and the knowledge. She went by different names in different places: wise woman, herbalist, midwife, healer. Occasionally, and this was dangerous, something less flattering. But in most villages, in most times, she was simply the person you went to when something was wrong. Her knowledge came from somewhere old. Not books, she likely couldn't read. Not a university, women weren't admitted. From her mother, and her mother's mother before that. Passed down in the only way it could be passed. Spoken, demonstrated, practiced, herb by herb, season by season, patient by patient. This was not folk nonsense. Some of it, at least, was genuinely effective medicine, accumulated over generations of careful observation. This plant helps this. That plant makes things worse. Boil these roots. Dry these leaves. Never combine these 2. Centuries of trial and error, stored not in manuscripts, in memory. Let's walk through what she actually knew, because some of it is remarkable. Willow bark, stripped from the white willow tree, boiled into a tea or chewed directly, used for pain and fever. We now know why it worked. Willow bark contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, which is the active compound in aspirin. She didn't know any of that. She just knew it helped. Because she'd seen it help. Because her mother had seen it help. Because generations of sick people had drunk willow bark tea and felt better. Garlic, used for infections, for chest complaints, for keeping wounds clean. We know now that garlic has genuine antimicrobial properties. She just knew it worked. Honey, applied to wounds. Honey is hygroscopic. It draws moisture out of bacteria, killing them. It was one of the best wound treatments available in the medieval world. And she knew it. Even without the word hygroscopic. Even without any of the science. Just Honey on a wound. Keeps it clean. Helps it heal. Observation. Passed forward. Generation after generation. In a cottage at the edge of a village. But not all of it worked. And this is where the medieval healer's world gets more complicated. Because she was working in a world without germ theory, without any understanding of how disease actually spread, without microscopes, without chemistry, without any of the frameworks that modern medicine is built on. So when something didn't have an obvious physical cause, when someone wasted away for no apparent reason, when a child had convulsions, when a man went mad, the explanation had to come from somewhere. And in medieval Europe, that somewhere was usually one of two places: God, or the other one. Illness that couldn't be explained by natural causes was often attributed to supernatural ones. A curse, an evil eye, the influence of a malevolent spirit, something that had gotten inside you and needed to be driven out. Which meant the treatment was not physical. It was spiritual. Prayers, charms, specific words spoken over the patient in a specific order. Amulets worn against the body. Particular saints invoked for particular ailments. Saint Roch for plague. Saint Blaise for throat complaints. Saint Apollonia, who had her teeth pulled out during her martyrdom, for toothache. The medieval world had a saint for everything, which was either very convenient or not nearly convenient enough, depending on whether it worked. The healer moved between these two worlds, the practical and the spiritual, without seeing any contradiction. She would give you the willow bark tea, and she would say the words over it, the herbs and the prayer together. Because why would you choose one when you could have both? This made her relationship with the church complicated sometimes. The church approved of prayer and saints and religious healing. It was less enthusiastic about the herbs and the charms and the old words. Some of those words were very old, older than Christianity in that region, survivals from something before. The church called this superstition. The village called it what worked. And the line between the two was blurry and constantly negotiated. Most of the time, the local priest and the village healer had a working relationship. He handled the soul, she handled the body. They didn't step on each other's ground if they could help it. Most of the time. Let's talk about childbirth, because this was the center of the healer's work. In medieval Europe, childbirth was the most dangerous thing a woman regularly did. Maternal mortality was high. Infant mortality was devastating. The numbers, when you look at them, are genuinely hard to read. And the healer, or the midwife, often the same person, was the one who was there, through the long hours of labor, with her herbs and her knowledge and her hands and whatever prayers she knew. She knew which positions helped. She knew which herbs eased pain and which helped the womb contract afterward. She knew the signs that something was going wrong. She had seen birth go wrong, more than once, more than she wanted to remember. And she came anyway. Every time the knock came at her door in the middle of the night, she got up, gathered what she needed, and went. In rain, in snow, in the middle of the night in winter, across muddy fields and dark paths to wherever she was needed. Because someone needed her, and there was no one else. Now, let's spend a moment in her cottage, in the evening, after a long day. The fire is burning low. The herbs overhead move slightly in the warm air rising from it. Lavender, rosemary, dried chamomile, bundles of something darker and more pungent she uses for drawing out infections. The smell is extraordinary, layered, complex, old. She is sitting by the fire, preparing something, grinding dried roots in a small stone mortar. Slow, circular movements. The sound of stone on stone. Steady, repetitive, oddly calming. On the shelf behind her, her store, collected through the summer, dried and prepared and stored against the winter. Because winter was when people got sick. Winter was when she was needed most. And she had to be ready. She knows every jar, every pouch, every bundle. Knows what's inside without looking. Knows how much she has and how much she'll need. She has been doing this long enough that the knowledge is in her hands as much as her mind. Just the fire and the grinding, and the smell of 100 dried plants filling a small, warm room. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the village healer. Something that doesn't get said enough. She was trusted. Deeply. Genuinely trusted. In a world where trust was hard to come by, and authority was often something imposed from above rather than earned, people trusted her. They came to her with the things they couldn't take anywhere else. Not just illness. Grief. Fear. Loneliness. The kinds of suffering that don't have a physical symptom. She listened. That was part of the work, too. Maybe the most important part. In a world with no concept of what we'd now call mental health, she was sometimes the closest thing to it. The woman who sat with you, who didn't judge, who had seen enough of human suffering to know that most of it was simply part of being alive, and who gave you something warm to drink, and told you to rest. Simple, but not small. Never small. Outside the cottage, the village is dark. The last lights going out one by one. People settling into their beds. The cold pressing in from outside. Inside, the fire still burning. The herbs still moving slowly in the warm air. The healer still at her work. Or perhaps asleep in her chair by now. The mortar still in her lap. The fire doing its quiet work without her. Tomorrow someone will come to the door. They always do. A child with a fever. A man with a wound that isn't healing. A woman who is frightened and doesn't know why. She will get up. She will reach for the right jar. She will put the pot on the fire, and she will be ready. Because she is always ready. Because someone has to be. Let that warm light stay with you. That one small fire. In a cottage full of herbs and old knowledge and quiet competence. Feel the warmth of it, even from here, even through the dark. There's no hurry, no knock at the door tonight, just the fire, and the smell of lavender and rosemary, and something older than either. Chapter 8 is waiting, the long winter, the darkest, quietest chapter of the year, when the world went still, and people drew close to whatever warmth they had. But only when you're ready. You might already be gone. It's cold. Not the kind of cold you feel walking from a warm car to a warm building. The other kind. The kind that has been here for weeks already. The kind that has settled into the walls and the floor and the ground outside and has no intention of leaving. The kind of cold that becomes the background of everything. That you stop noticing except in moments. When you first step outside, when the fire goes low in the night, when you wake before dawn and the blanket isn't quite enough. Welcome to medieval winter, which was longer than you think, darker than you think, and quieter than anything the modern world has left room for. Let's start with the darkness, because the darkness of a medieval winter is something worth understanding. In Northern Europe, England, France, Germany, Scandinavia, a winter day might give you 8 hours of usable light, sometimes less. The sun rose late, set early, and the light in between was thin and gray and not always enough for detailed work. Candles and torches helped, but they were expensive. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were the common ones. They smoked, they smelled, they gave a weak, yellowish light that flickered with every draft. And drafts were everywhere. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter, but beeswax was a luxury. Most households used tallow, and most households used as few candles as possible, because every candle cost something. And winter was already expensive enough. So you worked by daylight when you could. And when the daylight went, you largely stopped. The medieval winter evening was long, very long. Darkness falling at 4 in the afternoon, 14 hours until dawn. 14 hours of dark and cold and firelight, which meant that medieval people in winter slept more than at any other time of year, went to bed earlier, woke later, their bodies following the light the way bodies will when there's nothing artificial to override it. The world going dark, and people going with it. Now, the work of winter. Because even in the coldest months, there was always work. Less than summer, less urgent than harvest, but constant. The animals needed tending every single day regardless of season. The cow, the pigs, the chickens. Fed, watered, the stalls cleaned. Every morning, every evening. In the dark, in the cold. Across a yard that was frozen solid or deep in mud, depending on whether the temperature had gone above or below freezing that week. Wood needed chopping. Always. The fire consumed wood continuously, and the wood pile needed to be large enough to last until spring. Running out of wood in February was not a minor inconvenience. It was a crisis. So you chopped. Through autumn, through the early winter, building the pile, watching it, rationing it as the weeks went on and spring felt very far away. Tools needed repairing. The plow that had made it through harvest on borrowed time. The harness that needed new leather. The thatch that had thinned in one corner and let in rain. Winter was when you fixed the things you hadn't had time to fix when the fields were demanding everything. Slow work. Indoor work mostly. Work done by firelight. Hands busy while the body stayed warm. Let's talk about food. Because winter food was a completely different experience from the rest of the year. Autumn was about preservation. Everything that could be preserved was. Meat salted and hung. Vegetables dried or stored in root cellars. Grain stored in granaries against damp and rats and theft. Cheese made from the summer's milk. Apples stored in cool, dark places. Herbs dried and hung, like in the healer's cottage. Everything the summer had given, captured somehow, and held against the cold months. By midwinter, the fresh food was gone. What was left was the preserved food, which meant salt. A lot of salt. Salted meat, salted fish, everything preserved in brine. Which meant that by late winter, almost everyone in medieval Europe was quietly vitamin deficient. Not dramatically ill, necessarily, just depleted. A certain tiredness, a slowness, skin that didn't look right, wounds that healed slowly, the body running on whatever it had stored up, running a little low by February, running lower by March. And then, spring. The first green shoots, the first fresh thing in months. The relief of that first fresh food after a long winter was something medieval people wrote about, felt physically. The body recognizing what it had been missing. Something we almost never experience now. That particular hunger, that particular relief. Here's something that surprises people about medieval winter. It wasn't entirely grim. The church calendar was front-loaded with celebrations in winter. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas in February. A series of feast days and holy days scattered through the darkest months. Not by accident. The church understood what darkness did to people, and it placed lights in the darkness deliberately. Christmas in medieval Europe was not one day, it was 12. The 12 days of Christmas, which is a real thing, not just a song, ran from Christmas Day on the 25th of December to Epiphany on the 6th of January. 12 days of celebration, of feasting and music and visiting and release from the normal rules of winter economy. For those 12 days, you were supposed to enjoy yourself. Even if you were poor, even if the woodpile was worrying you, even if February was coming, and you knew what February meant. For 12 days, you ate the good food. You drank more than usual. You gathered with your neighbors. You let yourself be warm. The medieval peasant at Christmas was not miserable. He was, for 12 days at least, genuinely, completely, wholeheartedly celebrating, grabbing the light while it was there, because he knew better than anyone that it didn't last. But then the 12 days ended, and January settled in. January was the hardest month. The celebrations over, the best food eaten, but darkness still absolute. Spring still genuinely far away. There's a reason January appears so bleak in medieval literature and art. The illuminated manuscripts that survive from this period, those beautiful, hand-painted books of hours that monks and wealthy patrons commissioned, they showed the months as images. Each month had its associated labor, its associated feeling. And January was almost always shown the same way. A figure hunched by a fire. Outside, bare trees, frozen ground, gray sky. Inside, the fire, the blanket, the waiting. Just waiting. For something to change. For the light to come back. For the world to remember that it knew how to be warm. The long wait. That is January. That has always been January. And in that waiting, stories. This is what the long winter evenings were for. When the work was done, and the fire was the only light, and 14 hours of darkness stretched out ahead, people told stories. The medieval storytelling tradition was rich and deep and almost entirely oral. Most people couldn't read, but everyone could listen, and everyone had stories. Gathered around the fire in a peasant hut, or in the great hall of a castle, or in the common room of a monastery guest house, the stories came out. Some were religious, saints' lives, miracles, stories of faith rewarded and sin punished. Some were romantic, knights and ladies, quests and honor and love that transcended every obstacle. Some were funny, bawdy, the kind of humor that doesn't need explaining across 800 years. A foolish husband, a clever wife, a priest who wasn't as holy as he appeared. Medieval humor was earthier than people expect, and considerably more familiar. And some were frightening, because winter nights were made for frightening stories. The darkness outside pressing against the shutters, the fire the only barrier between you and whatever the darkness contained. creatures that came out in winter, spirits of the dead who walked on certain nights, the wild hunt, a terrifying procession of ghostly riders seen crossing the winter sky on stormy nights. If you heard them coming, you hid. You did not look up. You did not draw attention to yourself, because the wild hunt did not stop for you. It only took you with it. Let's slow down now and just sit for a moment in a medieval winter evening. A hut somewhere. Not important where exactly. England or France or Germany. The cold is the same. The fire in the center of the room, burning steadily. The wood was rationed today, but not too severely. There's enough for tonight. The family is arranged around it. William closest to the fire because he worked outside all day and his bones are still cold. His wife next to him, mending something by firelight. The children half asleep already, leaning against each other, against their parents, the way children do when the warmth and the firelight and the late hour conspire against them. Someone is talking, low, unhurried. Not a story exactly, just conversation. The day, the neighbor's cow, the state of the woodpile, whether the cold would break soon. Small talk, the most human of all human activities. Filling the silence not because the silence is unwelcome, but because the sound of a familiar voice is its own kind of warmth. Outside, nothing. Complete dark, complete quiet. The frozen ground, the bare trees, the stars very bright because there is nothing to compete with them. And in here, fire, and voices, and the weight of children leaning into you, and the long night stretching out ahead. Gentle now, just gentle. The fire burns lower. Someone adds a piece of wood. Not a big piece, just enough to keep it going through the night. The children are asleep now, carried to their straw mattresses without fully waking, tucked under the wool blanket, their breathing slow and deep already. William sits a little longer, looking at the fire, not thinking about anything in particular. The way you look at a fire when the day is over and the cold is outside, and there is genuinely nothing left to do. His wife has put down her mending. She is somewhere between awake and asleep. The way you get by a fire, that particular softness, that particular heaviness behind the eyes. The fire makes its small sounds, a crack, a settle, the occasional shift of wood. Outside, the wild hunt is not coming tonight. The spirits are elsewhere. The dark is just dark, cold and quiet and empty of everything except winter. And in here, just warmth. Just the breathing of sleeping children. Just the fire doing its patient work. Just this. Let the fire hold you. That medieval fire, 800 years old and still warm. The children are asleep. The cold is outside where it belongs. Chapter 9 is there. The feast. Candlelight and music and food that smells extraordinary. A world away from this quiet hut. But there's no rush to get there. No rush at all. The fire is enough. For now. The fire is more than enough. Let's go somewhere warmer tonight. Somewhere brighter. Somewhere that smells extraordinary. Roasting meat. Warm spices. Bread fresh from the oven. Wine being poured into cups that cost more than most people earned in a year. Welcome to the medieval feast, which, and I want to be honest with you right from the start, most people never attended. Not once. Not in their entire lives. The medieval feast was not a community event. It was not something you were invited to because you lived nearby. It was a performance of wealth and power, staged by people who had both. for an audience carefully selected to appreciate exactly how much wealth and power was on display. Some things have not changed at all. The stage is set. Let's start with the room. The great hall transformed for a feast was genuinely spectacular. Fresh rushes on the floor. Scented this time. Herbs mixed in deliberately. Lavender, mint, rosemary. So that when people walked across them, the smell rose up around their feet. Tapestries on the walls. Not just for decoration. Tapestries were insulation. They trapped warmth against the stone. But they were also a statement. A fine tapestry, woven with scenes of hunting or battle or biblical stories, cost an enormous amount of money. Hanging one was a way of saying, without saying anything, I have money, a great deal of money. Please notice. The tables were covered in white linen, which sounds simple but wasn't. Linen of that quality, in that quantity, laundered and pressed, was expensive, and it was changed between courses sometimes, lifted off, replaced with a fresh cloth, while the guests watched, while the guests were meant to notice. Everything at a medieval feast was meant to be noticed. That was the entire point. The currency of spices. Now, the food. The medieval feast menu was not what you'd expect. It wasn't just large quantities of simple food. It was complex, elaborate, deliberately strange sometimes. Because the point wasn't just to feed people. The point was to demonstrate what you could afford. Spices were the ultimate status symbol. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg. Things that came from the other side of the world, from the Spice Islands, from India, from the Arab trade routes. They cost extraordinary amounts of money, and they were used, not sparingly, but generously, ostentatiously, to show that you could afford to be generous with things that cost a fortune. A dish heavily spiced with cinnamon and ginger was not just delicious, it was a financial statement. Every bite saying, this household has connections. This household has wealth. This household can afford to make its food smell like somewhere impossibly far away. The theater of the table. The courses came in waves. Not 2 or 3 courses the way we think of a formal meal. Many more. A significant feast might have 5 or 6 courses, each course containing multiple dishes, all brought out together, arranged on the table, everything at once. There was roasted meat, always. Whole animals sometimes. A roasted pig, a swan, a peacock. The peacock was particularly prized. Not because it tasted extraordinary, it didn't particularly, but because it looked extraordinary. A peacock served with its feathers reattached, carried in by servants, placed on the table like a living thing. The visual drama of a medieval feast course was almost theatrical. Subtleties, elaborate sculptures made from sugar or marzipan, formed into castles, ships, heraldic animals, carried in to admiring sounds from the guests. Admired, and then eaten. The whole beautiful thing consumed. Because that too was the point. We can afford to eat art. Conspicuous consumption is not a modern invention. The social map. Now, let's talk about who was actually at this feast, because the guest list tells you everything. At the high table, the lord and his family, his most important guests, other lords, a bishop, perhaps, a visiting dignitary, people whose presence at your table said something about your standing. You didn't just invite anyone to sit near you at the high table. You invited people whose presence elevated you. Further down, knights, senior household members, important local figures. And at the far end, the less important guests, who still ate better than they did at home, but who were aware, at every moment, of exactly how far they were from the high table. The seating was a map of the social world. Every person placed exactly where they ranked. No ambiguity. No false modesty. You knew where you sat. Everyone knew where you sat. And everyone knew what it meant. Medieval society was hierarchical in a way that was completely explicit. Nobody pretended otherwise. Your place in the world was visible, announced, written into where you sat at dinner. Which sounds harsh, and was, but also had a certain clarity to it. You always knew exactly where you stood, whether you liked it or not. Let's talk about the music, because the medieval feast was never silent. Musicians played throughout, not background music the way we think of it. Present, audible, part of the experience. The instruments were different from what we're used to. Lutes, harps, pipes, drums. A shawm, a loud double-reeded instrument, something like an oboe, but considerably more insistent. Trumpets announcing each new course as it arrived. Between courses, entertainment. Acrobats, jugglers, a fool, the court jester, moving through the hall making jokes at everyone's expense, including, carefully, the Lord's expense. Because the fool was one of the few people allowed to say true things in a disguised way, allowed to point at the absurdity of power while pretending to be absurd himself. It was a delicate performance. The fool who went too far, who stopped being funny and started being threatening, discovered quickly that the protection of the motley only extended so far. But the good ones, the truly skilled ones, could say almost anything, wrapped in laughter, softened by bells and a painted face, truth dressed as nonsense, as it so often is. And now, the part of the feast most people forget about, outside the castle gates, in the dark. There were people there, waiting. Not guests, not servants, just people from the surrounding area who had heard there was a feast tonight. Because medieval feast culture had an obligation built into it, noblesse oblige, the nobility's duty to those below them, which meant that the leftovers from a great feast, and there were always leftovers, deliberately, strategically, planned leftovers, were distributed to the poor, to the hungry, to whoever was waiting at the gate. The almoner, a specific household official whose job was charitable distribution, managed this, collected what remained after the feast, brought it out, distributed it at the gate. Cold meat that had been hot an hour ago, bread from the feast table, broken pieces of the sugar subtlety that had been so admired, handed out in the dark to people who had not been invited inside, who had been outside all evening, in the cold, waiting for what was left. Not a feast, not even close to a feast, but something. On a night when the castle smelled of roasting meat and warm spices, and the music drifted over the walls. Something. From the table of people who had too much, to the hands of people who had too little. The same transaction, across every century. Let's go back inside now, to the end of the feast. The candles have burned down considerably. The food is largely gone. The music has slowed, quieter now. Something gentler being played in the corner. The guests are full, warm, that particular heavy warmth that comes after too much food and enough wine. The conversation is softened, people leaning back in their chairs, talking quietly. Not about anything important, just talking. The way people do when the evening has been good, and there's no reason to rush it to its end. The lord at the high table, his wife beside him, looking out at the hall, at the candles, the tapestries, the guests. at everything that has been arranged and managed and performed tonight. It went well. That's all you can ever say at the end of a feast. It went well. The food was praised. The wine was adequate. Nobody embarrassed themselves too badly. The right people were impressed. That was the goal. And tonight, it was achieved. The candles burn lower. The music plays on. And the long feast evening drifts toward its end. And outside, the people at the gate have gone home, carrying what they were given, walking back through the dark to wherever they came from, past William's hut, where the fire is low and the family is asleep, and there is no music and no spiced wine and no peacock with its feathers reattached, just the straw mattress and the wool blanket and the dark. Two worlds, separated by a wall and a gate and everything that wall and gate represented. Both under the same winter sky, both lit by the same cold stars, both, at the end of the night, just trying to sleep. Same as you, same as anyone, just trying to find the comfortable position, just waiting for the warmth to come, just letting the day go, letting it all go. The feast is over. The candles almost gone. The music stopped. Just the dark now, and the quiet, and that full, warm, heavy feeling of a night that went well. Chapter 10 is waiting. The night watch. The one person in the medieval town who doesn't get to sleep yet, who walks the dark streets alone while everyone else rests. But you don't have to go with him tonight. You can stay here, in the warmth, in the quiet, in the last glow of a feast that fed everyone it could reach. Just rest. Everyone is asleep. Almost everyone. William is asleep in his hut. The monks have said Compline and pulled their blankets up in the dark dormitory. The Lord's household is retired from the feast. The healer is dozing by her fire. The castle guard on the battlements is trying very hard not to join them. The medieval town at night is a different world entirely from the medieval town by day. All that noise, all that movement, all those people and animals and smells and transactions. Gone. What's left is this. Empty streets, locked doors, shuttered windows. A town that is folded in on itself like a hand closing. And one man, walking through it, alone, with a torch and a staff and the particular alertness of someone who knows that if something goes wrong tonight, it's his problem. This is the night watchman, and his night is just beginning. The true threat. Let's talk about medieval towns at night, because they were genuinely dangerous places. Not in an exciting, dramatic way, in a quiet, practical, very real way. Fire was the primary threat. A medieval town was almost entirely made of wood. Timber frames, wooden shutters, thatched roofs, buildings packed closely together along narrow streets. A single fire that got out of hand, a candle left burning, a hearth not properly banked, a spark that landed somewhere it shouldn't, could take out an entire street in an hour, an entire district in a night. Medieval town fires were not rare, they were regular. Almost every significant medieval town burned down at least once, some of them several times. London burned so many times that the Great Fire of 1666 was remarkable mainly for its scale, not its occurrence. Fire was simply a fact of urban medieval life. The question wasn't whether a fire would happen. The question was whether someone would catch it before it spread. That someone was the night watchman, walking his route, checking the streets, looking for the glow in a window that was wrong, the smell of smoke that didn't belong, the sound of something crackling that shouldn't be. Every night, for his entire working life. The system of the watch. Now, the night watch was not a single person in most towns. It was a system. Larger towns had organized watches, groups of men assigned to patrol specific areas through the night, in shifts sometimes. One group from dusk until midnight, another from midnight until dawn. These weren't always professional guards. In many towns, the watch was a civic obligation. Your turn came around and you did it, whether you wanted to or not, whether you'd had enough sleep or not, whether it was January and bitterly cold, or August and merely unpleasant. You took your turn, because everyone took their turn, because the alternative was nobody taking their turn, and nobody wanted to see what happened then. The equipment was simple: a torch, a staff, a horn or bell to raise the alarm if needed. That was it. No armor, no sword necessarily. Just a man and a light and the responsibility of a sleeping town. The covered fire. Let's walk with him for a while. The route is the same every night. He knows it by feel almost. This corner, that alley, the stretch along the market street, the church at the center of town with its dark bulk against the sky, the inn at the crossroads, always a potential source of trouble, always worth a slow pass. The streets are narrow. In daylight, they're crowded and loud and full of life. At night, there's something else. The buildings pressing in on both sides, the upper floors jutting out over the street, a feature of medieval construction that meant the street at ground level was considerably narrower than the sky above it. Walking through a medieval town at night was walking through a canyon, stone and wood on both sides. The torch lighting maybe 10 feet ahead. Everything beyond that? Absolute darkness. He knows what's in that darkness. Nothing, usually. A cat, a rat, the occasional dog that hasn't found its way home. Usually nothing. But the knowing doesn't make it smaller. The darkness is still the darkness. And 800 years of human instinct says, something lives in it. Something that doesn't come out in the day. The curfew. This is worth explaining, because the word curfew, which we still use, comes directly from the medieval French. Couvre-feu. Cover the fire. At a specific hour every evening, marked by a bell, all fires in the town were supposed to be covered, banked, smothered down to embers. Not extinguished necessarily, just controlled, made safe for the night. And people were supposed to be inside, off the streets, home. The curfew bell was the signal. After it rang, you had a reason to be outside or you didn't. And if you didn't have a reason, the night watch had questions. Who are you? Where are you going? Why are you out at this hour? Simple questions, with consequences if the answers were unsatisfactory.
Because the people who were out after curfew without good reason were, statistically, up to something. Thieves moved at night. People settling grievances moved at night. The kind of business that didn't bear doing in daylight moved at night. The night watch knew this, and the people doing those things knew the night watch knew. It was a quiet negotiation, conducted in darkness, across the whole of the medieval town every night. The watchmen trying to catch people, the people trying not to be caught. The same negotiation, every city, every century, still ongoing. Now, let's talk about what the watchmen feared. Because it wasn't just thieves.
The medieval night was populated with things that don't walk during the day, not in the practical sense, in the imaginative sense, which, in medieval Europe, was almost the same thing. The dead were restless, in medieval belief. Not metaphorically, literally. There were documented, serious, investigated cases of revenants, the medieval equivalent of what we'd call zombies, though considerably less dramatic. Dead people who were reported to have risen from their graves, who wandered, who disturbed the living, who spread disease, because medieval people noticed that disease spread from the recently dead, which is true, and concluded that the dead were actively causing it, which is a reasonable inference with the information available. When there was an outbreak of illness in a medieval town and someone suspected a revenant, a committee would go to the cemetery, dig up the body, check it. If it looked wrong, too fresh or bloated, or the wrong color, that was evidence. The body was dealt with. Decapitation, a stake, burning, buried again. Properly this time. This was not considered unusual. This was community health management, medieval style. The medieval approach to public health was creative, if nothing else. There were other things too. Demons were real to the medieval mind. Not metaphorically real, actually real, present in the world, particularly active at night, particularly interested in people who were alone, in the dark, away from the protection of community and church and prayer. The watchman carried more than a torch for this reason. A prayer, a specific phrase, a small religious object, protection. Because you didn't walk the dark streets of a medieval town without some acknowledgement of what might be walking them with you. This sounds like superstition, from where we stand, but put yourself in his position for a moment. No electric light anywhere. The darkness genuinely absolute beyond the torch. Sounds in the night that you can't identify. A world where bad things happened regularly and without explanation. Where disease came from nowhere and took people without reason. Where the line between the living and the dead was considered permeable.
In that world, the demons made sense. They were an explanation. A shape given to the shapeless fear, which is what we've always done with the things we can't explain. We give them a name, we give them a face, and then at least we know what we're afraid of. Hours pass, the watch continues, same streets, same corners, same slow circuit. The torch burning down and replaced from the supply he carries. The cold deepening as the night goes on. The kind of cold that settles into you slowly, that you don't fully feel until you stop moving. So you don't stop moving. You keep walking. The route, the corners, the alley, the market street, the church, the inn, the gate, round and round. Around 2 a.m, the hardest hour. The hour when the body most wants to stop. When the warmth of sleep becomes almost a physical pull. When the eyes want to close of their own accord. He knows this hour. He's been here before. Every watchman knows this hour. You walk a little faster, swing the torch, say something to yourself, a prayer, a count, the names of your children, anything to stay present, anything to keep the hour from pulling you under. The town sleeps on around him, completely unaware, warm in their beds, behind their locked doors. Safe, in part, because he is out here, walking, in the cold, in the dark, staying awake so they don't have to. That particular thankless, essential thing. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the darkness changes. Not lighter exactly, just less dark. The absolute black of midnight giving way to something slightly softer. The sky becoming distinguishable from the rooftops. The watchman notices, he always notices. Has been noticing since long before it's really visible. Counting toward it, dawn is coming. Not here yet, but coming. An hour away maybe. Less. The worst is over. The deep hours of the night. The hours when everything feels most uncertain, most cold, most alone, those are done. What's ahead is just the normal darkness before morning, which is a completely different thing. He stands for a moment. At a corner he's passed 20 times tonight. Holds the torch a little lower. Looks up at the sky. The stars beginning to fade. The faintest, most theoretical suggestion of gray at the horizon. He breathes. Another night almost done. The town still standing. No fires, no alarms, no demons claiming anyone tonight. Just a town that slept safely through the dark hours, because someone walked them, because someone stayed awake. Just this. Just him. And the coming light. The night is almost over. The watchman is still out there, walking the last hour, carrying the town through the morning. But you don't have to walk with him anymore. You've done enough tonight. You've walked the market and the fields and the castle and the monastery. You've sat by fires and heard stories and watched feasts from a distance. Chapter 11 is there. The scribe's candle. One monk, one candle, one manuscript, and the deep, quiet hours before dawn. But only if you need it. The dark is soft now. The town is safe. The watchman has it. You can let go.
One candle. That's all there is. One small flame in a very large darkness. A circle of light just wide enough for a desk. Just wide enough for a page. Just wide enough for one pair of hands moving slowly across parchment. Everything beyond that circle, dark. Stone walls, dark. The corridor outside, dark. The monastery dormitory where everyone else is sleeping, dark. But here, this one small light, and the scratch of a quill, and a monk who has been awake since matins and will not sleep again until prime, working through the deepest hours of the night, because the work doesn't stop, because the manuscript doesn't finish itself, because somewhere at the edge of his mind is the knowledge, quiet but constant, that what he is doing matters. Even if nobody ever tells him so, even if nobody ever reads it, it matters. The cell. We met the scriptorium briefly in Chapter 6, the monastery writing room, the monks copying manuscripts in daylight. But the scribe we're spending time with tonight isn't in the scriptorium. He's in a small cell, his own room, which is a privilege. Not every monk had one. In many monasteries, the monks slept in a communal dormitory their entire lives. But a senior scribe, a monk trusted with important work, might have a cell. Small, stone, a bed he barely uses, a desk, a shelf for his materials. And tonight, a reason to be awake. He is copying something specific, something that arrived recently from another monastery, a text that his abbot considered important enough to have copied immediately. Not tomorrow, not when time allowed. Now. So here he is. The monastery sleeping around him. The watchman somewhere outside walking his route. And this monk, bent over his desk. Candle close enough to work by, far enough not to drip on the parchment, which has happened before, and will not happen again if he can help it. The materials. Let's talk about the materials, because the tools of a medieval scribe were not simple, and not cheap. The parchment first. Not paper. Paper existed. It had come to Europe from the Arab world through Spain, but parchment was still preferred for important documents. More durable, more permanent. Parchment was made from animal skin, sheep or goat usually, calf for the finest work, called vellum. The skin was soaked, stretched on a frame, scraped thin with a curved blade, and dried. A single Bible required the skins of hundreds of animals. The result was a writing surface that was smooth on one side, slightly rough on the other, that had a faint grain to it. that was warm to the touch, in a way paper never quite is. Expensive. Everything about this work was expensive, which is why mistakes mattered so much. Scrape too hard to fix an error, and you thinned the parchment. Scraped through it, and you had a hole in the middle of a page of manuscript that the scribe then had to work around. Some surviving manuscripts have exactly these holes. You can see where the scribe reached them, see how he adjusted, wrote around the gap, kept going. The medieval scribe's relationship with imperfection was intimate and ongoing. The tools. The quill. Cut from a large feather. Goose, usually. Swan for finer work. The tip cut at a precise angle with a small knife. A penknife, which is where that word comes from, to create a nib that held ink and released it smoothly. A good quill lasted maybe a week of heavy use. Then it needed cutting again, resharpening. A skilled scribe could feel when the nib was going, the ink flow changing slightly, the line thickening where it should be fine. He kept his penknife close, used it constantly, cut and recut the nib through the night, feeling for the right point, the angle that made the ink flow exactly as it should. There is an intimacy to writing with a quill that typing will never replicate. The direct connection between hand and page, the sensitivity required. Too much pressure, the nib splays. Too little, the ink skips. Just enough, and the letter forms perfectly. Clean, even, exactly as it should be. He has been doing this for decades. His hands know the pressure without thinking about it. His wrist knows the angle. The letters emerge from him the way walking emerges, not thought about, just done. The body remembering what the mind no longer has to.
The ink. Most medieval ink was iron gall ink, made from oak galls, those strange, round growths that appear on oak trees when a wasp lays eggs under the bark. Crushed and soaked in water, mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic. The result was a dark, slightly brownish-black ink that bonded chemically with the parchment, not just sitting on the surface, actually bonding with it. Which is why manuscripts from the 8th century can still be read today, why the words are still there, still dark, still clear, 1,000 years later. Iron gall ink, made from tree growths and iron and water, surviving longer than almost anything else those people touched or made or cared about. The scribe dips his quill, gently, not too deep, too much ink and it blobs, just to the right point. Taps the edge of the inkwell once to remove the excess, and writes. What is he copying tonight? Let's say it's a chronicle, a history of a monastery in the south of France, written by a monk there 50 years ago, who wrote it from memory and from older documents, who was himself copying from something even older, a chain of hands reaching back through time, each one passing the words to the next, each one making sure they didn't disappear. The text is in Latin. He reads Latin well, has read it since he was a child oblate, a boy given to the monastery by his family to be raised there. Latin is, in some ways, more natural to him than his native tongue. He reads ahead before writing. A sentence, 2 sentences, gets the shape of it in his mind, then writes, not looking at the original while his hand moves. He knows it now. It's in him. This is the flow state of the medieval scriptorium, when the reading and the writing become one continuous motion, when the words pass through him like water through a channel, from the page he reads, through his mind, through his hand, onto the page he writes.
becoming something new and something old at exactly the same time. The race against the wax. The candle is burning down. He notices. He always notices. Candles were not unlimited. The monastery allocated them carefully, and a candle burned through in the middle of the night was a candle not available tomorrow. He calculates. How much is left? How much work remains? Whether they balance. They don't quite balance. He'll need to work a little faster in the next hour, or accept that tonight's work ends when the candle ends. He chooses to work faster, slightly. Not rushing. Rushing makes errors, and errors cost parchment. But a little less pause between sentences. A little less time looking at the flame. Back to the page. The quill moving again. The letters forming in the small, warm circle of light. Outside, the night is at its deepest. That particular stillness that comes in the hours before dawn, when even the wind has gone quiet, when the world seems to hold its breath. In here, just the scratch of the quill, and the candle, and the words accumulating slowly on the page, one after another, steady as breathing. Let me tell you something about the margins. Medieval manuscripts are full of marginalia, notes in the margins, written by scribes, sometimes annotations to the text, sometimes translations of difficult words, sometimes, and this is the part I love, something else entirely. A complaint, a small, human, completely unguarded complaint, written in the margin of a manuscript that was supposed to contain only the sacred or the scholarly. Things like, the parchment is hairy, meaning the surface isn't smooth enough. It's difficult to write on. New parchment, bad ink, I say nothing more. A scribe having a bad night and letting posterity know about it. Oh, my hand. Just that. Oh, my hand. After hours of writing. The cramp setting in, the fingers aching. And no one to say it to except the margin. Let the reader's voice honor the writer's pen. A gentle request, across 1,000 years, from a tired scribe to whoever eventually held his work. Please, read this aloud. Give my words a voice. I worked so hard. These little notes, these tiny breaks in the formal surface of the manuscript, where the person inside the monk briefly appears, tired, frustrated, funny sometimes, completely, immediately human, 800 years ago, and still somehow right here. The flame dips. The candle is very low now. He finishes the line he's on, sets the quill down carefully, in its rest, so the nib doesn't dry. He sits back, straightens his spine, which has been curved over this desk for hours, the stretch of it moving through him slowly.
He looks at what he's done tonight. Several pages. Good pages. The letters even, the lines straight, no major errors. One correction. A word written twice, the second occurrence crossed through neatly. But otherwise, clean work. Good work. He doesn't think this with pride exactly. Pride is a sin, and he knows it. But there is something, a quiet satisfaction. The particular feeling of a thing done well. That doesn't require an audience. That doesn't need to be noticed. Just done well, for its own sake. He closes the manuscript he was copying from, carefully, both covers brought together, the pages compressed gently, tied with the cord that keeps it closed. He covers his inkwell, cleans the quill tip on a small cloth,
lays it in its case. Everything in its place. Everything ready for tomorrow. The candle gutters. Once. Twice. The flame dipping low. Almost gone. He watches it, not moving. Just watching the flame make its last few attempts. There is something about a candle going out that has always meant something. More than just darkness coming. Something about the ending of a small, warm thing that was doing its best. The flame dips, steadies briefly, dips again, and goes out. The darkness is complete. But he doesn't move immediately. He knows this room by heart, knows where the door is, knows the corridor outside, knows his way to the dormitory where his narrow bed is waiting. He sits for a moment in the complete dark, the smell of extinguished candle around him, warm wax, smoke, and the manuscript sitting there, invisible now, but there. The words still wet, almost, still warm from the attention paid to them. He gets up, quietly, moves to the door, carries nothing, needs nothing. The work is done for tonight. The words are on the page. They will still be there in the morning. They will still be there in 100 years, in 1,000. Long after the candle, long after the monk, long after everything except the words themselves, still there. The candle is out. The scribe is gone. The manuscript is dark and quiet on the desk. The words are safe. You kept watch tonight, through the market and the monastery, through the castle and the healer's cottage, through the long winter and the feast and the dark streets, through this one small candle burning down to nothing. You made it to the last chapter. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you're hearing this from somewhere far away, from the edge of sleep, or past it. Either way, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Chapter 12 is the last one. The long sleep. How medieval people said goodnight. How they let the day go. How they drifted away from the world for a few hours and trusted it to still be there in the morning. Just like you. Right now. Just like you.
We've come a long way tonight. The market and the fields, the castle and the monastery, the healer's fire and the feast and the dark streets, the scribe's candle burning down to nothing. We've walked through an entire medieval world together, and now, at last, we've arrived at the thing this whole long night has been moving toward. Sleep. Not dramatic sleep. Not the sleep of exhausted soldiers or fevered patients. Just the ordinary, quiet, completely unremarkable sleep of ordinary people at the end of an ordinary day. The most common human experience there is. 800 years ago, and right now, exactly the same. Lying down, letting go, trusting the dark. The threshold of the night. Let's talk about how medieval people ended their days. Because there were rituals. Small ones. Quiet ones. The kind of rituals that don't make it into the history books because they were too ordinary to record. But that existed nonetheless. Because humans have always needed a threshold. A moment of transition. Between the day and the night. Between the world and the self. The evening prayer was the first. For almost everyone in medieval Europe, peasant or lord, monk or merchant, the day ended with prayer. Compline for the monks, a simpler version for everyone else. But something, some acknowledgement at the end of the day that the day was ending, that the night was coming, that you were, in some way, entrusting yourself to something larger than yourself for the next few hours. This wasn't performative necessarily. For most people, it was as natural as washing your hands. Just what you did. At the end of the day. Every day. From childhood. Until you didn't have days anymore. the weight of the dark. Then the candle. The decision of when to put the candle out was not trivial. Candles cost money. Every minute of candlelight was a small expenditure. And so you didn't burn them longer than necessary. You did what needed doing by candlelight. The prayer, the undressing, the final arrangements of the room. And then you put it out. Not blown out usually. Snuffed. A small cone-shaped snuffer placed over the flame, cutting off the air. The flame going out without the small drama of being blown. And the darkness that followed was absolute. No streetlights filtering through the curtains. No standby lights on electronic devices. No ambient glow from anything at all. Just dark. The kind of dark that has weight to it, that you feel pressing against your open eyes. Medieval people were comfortable in this darkness in a way we no longer are. It was simply the darkness, the normal condition of the world after sunset. Nothing to be alarmed about, nothing to push back against. Just night. And you in it. Lying down, closing your eyes, finding that the darkness behind your eyelids is exactly the same as the darkness in the room. And somehow, that's a comfort. Faces in the moonlight. Let's visit them one last time. The people we've spent this night with. William, asleep in his hut at the edge of the village, on his straw mattress, under his wool blanket, his wife's breathing slow and even beside him. The children somewhere nearby. The fire completely out now. The cold settled in. But he is warm enough. The body knows how to keep itself alive. And his body has been doing it for 40 years in conditions like this. His hands are still. Those hands that plowed all day. Still now. Completely still. The field already waiting for him. But not yet. The monks, in their dormitory. 30 men breathing in the dark. The great silence holding everything. Some of them already deep in that first sleep. The one that will be interrupted by matins in a few hours. One of them is dreaming. Something about a field. He grew up near a field. The dream doesn't know about the monastery. The dream only knows the field, and the feeling of grass underfoot. Some things the sleep keeps safe. The things the day doesn't have room for anymore.
Medieval people took dreams seriously. Not in a vague, general way. Seriously. Dreams were considered communications. From God, from angels, from the saints, occasionally from less welcome sources. There were entire treatises written about dream interpretation, what different symbols meant, what different kinds of dreams signified, whether a dream came from a divine source or a bodily one, because it was understood that some dreams were simply the body processing the day. Too much food, too much ale, a fever beginning. These produced certain kinds of dreams, confused, disturbing, full of things that didn't connect. But other dreams, clear ones, vivid ones, dreams that left you changed when you woke, those were different. Those meant something. Kings made decisions based on dreams. Saints reported them in their writings. Ordinary people mentioned them in the few personal letters that survive. I dreamed of my mother last night. She told me not to travel south. And they listened, because in a world without psychology, without any framework for the unconscious mind, the dream was the closest thing to a direct message from somewhere beyond yourself. And why would you ignore that? The great silence. The castle is quiet, the lord asleep behind his curtained bed, the servants on their pallets in the corridor, the garrison in their quarters. The great hall empty and dark except for one ember glowing in the enormous hearth. Someone will bank it properly before dawn. Someone always does. The castle at rest is a different thing from the castle awake. All that hierarchy, all that performance, the careful management of who sits where, and who speaks first, and who holds the door. All of it suspended in sleep. The Lord and the lowest servant are doing exactly the same thing. The same unconsciousness, the same vulnerability, the same complete surrender to something that doesn't care about rank or title or the size of your estate. Sleep is the great equalizer. It always has been. Every night, without exception. No one is too important to need it. No one is too poor to have it. Just bodies, horizontal in the dark, breathing, dreaming, gone from themselves for a little while. The same. All of them the same. The night watch rituals. The healer's cottage. She is asleep in her chair after all. The fire burned low beside her. The herbs overhead still in the warm air. Her hands in her lap. That stone mortar still there. The pestle resting against it. She looks smaller asleep. They all do. And now, one last thing, before we let the night finish itself. There is a superstition, a practice, that existed across medieval Europe in various forms, of placing something specific under your pillow at night. An herb, a small religious object, a piece of written prayer, to protect the sleeper, to keep the night safe. In England, there was a tradition of placing a sprig of rosemary under the pillow, for protection, for good dreams, for remembrance. In other places, a written charm, a few words from Scripture, folded small, tucked beneath the head, God's words closest to the dreaming mind. In some traditions, shoes placed beside the bed pointing outward, so that if something came in the night, it would see the shoes pointed toward the door and think you had already left, and move on. The giving up of the day. So, that's how they said goodnight, the medieval world. A prayer, a candle snuffed, a sprig of something under the pillow, and then the giving up of the day, the full, complete, trusting surrender to the dark. We've spent the whole night here, together, in a world that is 800 years gone. And yet, the straw mattress and the wool blanket, the fire that needs tending, the prayer before sleep, the dream that takes you somewhere the day never could, none of that is gone. Not really. It's just underneath. Under the electric lights and the memory foam and the notifications. Still there. The same body. The same dark. The same need for the night to hold you gently. William is asleep in his field. The monks are dreaming. The scribe's words are drying on the page. The watchman is watching the dawn come. The healer is in her chair. The feast is over. The candles are out. And you are exactly where you should be. In the dark. In the quiet. At the end of a long night in a world that knew how to rest. Let it carry you. The way it always has. The way it always will. Good night.
If you made it this far, thank you. Truly. If this helped you sleep, subscribe. There are more nights like this one coming. More worlds to drift through. More fires to sit beside. More history that moves slowly enough to carry you somewhere quiet. Leave a comment telling me where you watched from, and what time it was. I read every single one. And if someone you know needs a night like this, send it to them. Good night.
from wherever this found you. Good night.